Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vic Thazia, and I'm the founder of Runners for Public Lands, and I'm also on the board of directors of Los Padres ForestWatch. And it's a unique pleasure this afternoon to introduce my friend and one of the greatest environmentalists in our region today, Bryant Baker, who is a founding board member of Runners for Public Lands and the director of conservation and research for Los Padres ForestWatch. Bryant has a master's degree in environmental science from the University of Arkansas, and since then, he's really spent the last decade becoming an expert on a number of things like land and water conservation issues, wildfire science, and he's done a lot of community outreach. I'm very excited to know him and to see him in action in this Public Lands 101 webinar. He's also a well-known naturalist, an excellent communicator on all things environmental, and an award-winning photographer. And so I'm so excited to hand it over to Bryant.
Great, thanks, Vic. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me. And yeah, excited to talk about public lands. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. So this presentation, we actually did something very similar to this in person a while back in Ventura. And this is a very similar presentation to that. It focuses on public lands in California and in the sort of Central Coast and Southern California region specifically. The main question, I think, that I'm trying to answer for folks a lot is like, what are public lands? Like, what does that actually mean? I think we've all heard that term, and you may have some sort of idea of what that is, but it can mean different things based on who you're talking to and what you're talking about exactly. So this is just a sort of definition that I've come up with that I think is pretty good, but it could probably be improved. Lands and waters collectively owned by the public and managed by federal, state, or local government agencies. I think this encapsulates a lot of our public lands in the region and in the United States in general. We are Runners for Public Lands. That is the the mission is sort of in the name of the organization, but we don't just focus on public lands that are under that maybe stricter definition that I just showed you. We also work to help and protect lands that are actually owned privately, but are open to the public through conservation easements, things like that. There are a lot of good examples of that throughout the region. This is a photo of Vic, who you just saw introduce me. This is him running at Harmon Canyon Preserve, which is a private property in Ventura, but it's managed by the Ventura Land Trust, who opens it to the public. So it is private land that is open to the public. We kind of lump that in with public lands in some ways. So what I'm going to talk about today is mostly federal lands. That's what I'm going to focus on today. That's my specialty. But just understand that there are a lot of different types of public lands. Again, there's that sort of private lands that are open to the public through conservation easements or as land trusts, preserves, things like that. But there are also a lot of state public lands. So there's state parks, ecological reserves, places that often the public are able to go and visit and enjoy. Some state lands are actually managed very specifically for for wildlife, and so there may be limits to how much the public can access those areas. And then there are also local public lands, so your city parks, open spaces, county parks, things like that. But again, I'm going to focus more on the federal public lands. But if we look at California, and this is just this sort of geographic focal area for us right now, and there's a lot of public lands. I mean, it's kind of amazing just how much of California is public land in one way or another. So there's a lot of national forest. There are a lot of national parks, including very large national parks like Death Valley. There's also land that is managed by the Bureau of Land Management. There are a lot of state parks, state beaches, state recreation areas. Um, there's just a lot of public land in California, and that is one of the things to sort of celebrate about this state, and the amazing landscapes and ecosystems that we have here. A lot of them are protected in various ways, and that's something to be celebrated, I think. So if we zoom in a little bit more to the area that Runners for Public Lands really focuses on right now, we're still a relatively young organization, and we're based out of Ventura. Most of our board is in the Ventura and Santa Barbara area, but we also have people from Thousand Oaks in LA. We have someone up in Oregon, actually. So we do have people kind of all over, but this still is really our area of intense focus. And you can see the Los Padres National Forest is a huge part of the regional public land system. This is the piece of public land that I focus on the most, and as part of my job as the Director of Conservation and Research at Los Padres ForestWatch, as you can imagine. But I also do a lot of work with the Carrizo Plain National Monument, which I will talk about today. And these are two really big pieces of public land, but we also have Channel Islands National Park, Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. I'm going to talk about those as well. I do want to point out, I mean, there is a really, really big piece of private land that is open to the public in some ways. Wind Wolves Preserve, a huge piece of private land that is conserved. So this is something that is really cool in our area. I do just want to point out that when we talk about public lands, all of these lands are traditional homelands for various Native American tribes and groups. We actually at Forest Watch, we put together a really cool interactive map where you can explore sort of these ancestral land sort of boundaries, which are not, these aren't exact. There's the concept of land ownership is very different, among Native Americans, especially compared to contemporary land ownership definitions and the way we deal with that. But we do have this really cool interactive map where you can actually see, if you really like spending time in the Los Padres National Forest, you would see that most of that is in the Chumash ancestral homeland area. And there's still many Chumash people and groups that are in this area and work to, protect and steward these places. So this is really important to keep in mind as we talk about this. You can check this out at lpfw.org/homelands. So again, I'm going to focus on federal public lands, and there are a lot of different types of land that can be managed by some sort of federal agency. I'm not going to talk about all of them. There's so many of them. We have a lot of these in California, but the main ones that I'm going to talk about are national parks, national monuments, national wildlife refuges, and national forests, national recreation areas, and then wilderness area. And you can see that all of these are managed by various agencies. Some are only managed by one agency or another, like National Forest. Those are really only managed by the Forest Service versus a national park, which would be managed by the National Park Service. And you can see it's even more interesting because like the Forest Service is in the Department of Agriculture, whereas the National Park Service is within the Department of the Interior. So there are a lot of, nuances to that, and I'll try to discuss that a little bit. So let's start with national parks. These are probably the most well-known pieces of public land in our public land system in the United States. They've been around some of them have been around for a long time. The National Park Service has been around for quite a while. The National Park Service, of course, is the managing agency of national parks. It is within the Department of the Interior, as I was just talking about. There are about 52 million acres of national parks in the United States. Just like what you see here, this is Yosemite. So everything you see in this image is part of a national park in California. The first national park was Yellowstone. That was established in 1872. And it's interesting if you look at the act of Congress that actually established Yellowstone. It said that the purpose of establishing Yellowstone National Park shall provide for the preservation from injury or spoliation of all timber, mineral deposits, natural curiosities, or wonders within said park. And the reason for this, you have to put this in context of what was happening at that time. There was a lot of westward expansion of American, um, I would say American capitalism. There was a lot of movement across North America, just in general, toward the Western United States, and a lot of that was driven by sort of economic reasons. And so there was a lot of what I would consider quite ecologically damaging activities happening across the country, especially in the Western United States. So there was a lot of mining. This is a really interesting image from California. This is up in Northern California, where basically all the vegetation was killed by a smelting operation that was nearby. So they were actually smelting ore that was being mined in that area. And so these fumes were killing everything. Dams were being created. And then one of the really big ones besides mining was logging. There was just a massive amount of logging. And so the national park concept really arose out of this problem where you had a lot of people coming into these areas and just destroying places, all for economic gain. And so some folks had the foresight to try to protect some of these places from these types of damaging activities. And then that's sort of the legacy of where we're at today. That's where it all sort of started. So in California, we have several national parks, some very well-known national parks, like Yosemite, Sequoia, and Kings Canyon, and Death Valley, our largest national park in California. Pinnacles is the youngest national park. That used to be a national monument, but was turned into a national park in 2013. And I'll talk about the what I would call like the national monument to national park pipeline. That's a very common way that national parks become designated, as they start out as national monuments. But you can see a lot of these go back to the 1800s, or well, some of them like Sequoia and Yosemite, and a lot of them go back to the early 1900s. But some might be more recent than you would think, like the Channel Islands, that was established in 1980. Death Valley was only established in 1994. I find that to be pretty interesting, that some of these national parks are a little bit younger than you might expect. And to go back to this idea of national parks and a lot of public lands in general, they are sort of providing areas that are being excluded from really intense extractive activities on the landscape. You can actually see this just in the last 20 years if we look at Redwood National Park. So this is that green outline. This is Redwood National Park. And what I want you to look at is all around it. I want you to look for, this is a time-lapse video that I'm going to play. Look for clear-cut logging, basically. That's what you're going to see on the private lands around the national park. So here we go. So you can really see lots of clear cutting here, clear cutting happening all along here, right? And what you're not seeing is all of that being done in the national park. So there is a lot of value in that. If you look closely, you will see evidence of old clear cutting in the national park. And that is still an issue. There's a legacy of a lot of intensive logging operations in that national park that were going on up until right before it was designated as a park. And so there's still problems from that, but it's getting some it's getting some relief from all of this intensive extractive activity that's happening in the landscapes around it. So, oops, I didn't mean for it to keep going. There we go. Okay, so in the Ventura region, in the region where Runners for Public Lands really focuses Our closest national park is the Channel Islands National Park. It's about 250,000 acres. It is across these 4 main islands, so Anacapa, Santa Cruz, Santa Rosa, and San Miguel. And I did put these are the traditional, the Chumash names for these islands, which I'm not going to try to pronounce, but it's important to remember that these islands are still known as these names to Chumash folks in the area. What you'll notice, though, is there's a big chunk of Santa Cruz Island that is not included in the national park, and that's because it is still technically privately owned by the Nature Conservancy, actually. So there's some interesting complexity to that. The national park on the islands, it actually started as a national monument. It was established in 1938 by FDR. And in 1980, there was a congressional act that converted the national monument to a national park. However, the entire island of Santa Rosa was privately owned even after this area became a national park. So it was privately owned until 1986, and then it was finally that island was converted over to the National Park Service. And the park, if you've ever been there, if you're familiar with the park, one of the really important aspects of why it's protected is actually the island kit fox, which it really was experiencing major declines in populations until the last few decades, and the national park being established, the national monument being established in back in the 30s, and then becoming a national park in the 80s really helped with protecting this fox, and has allowed its populations to rebound in a lot of ways. Other management activities and strategies have also been incredibly important to the recovery of this species. And now you can actually go and visit these islands, and it would be more unlikely to leave the island having not seen one of these. They're just incredibly common now when you go and visit. All right, let's talk about national monuments. So national monuments are really interesting, and they're one of a couple of different types of federal public lands that can be actually managed by multiple different agencies. So there's not one single agency that is responsible for national monuments. It very much depends on the type of land that, like who the agency or agencies were that were managing the land before it becomes a national monument. So another way to think about this is that national monuments always start out as some sort of public land, and then they get this sort of upgrade to national monument status. But it's usually that the agency that was managing the land before it became a national monument is going to be the agency managing it as a national monument. Hopefully that makes sense. So these are designated mainly by presidential proclamation, but they can also be designated by Congress. They can include land or marine water. So this is one of the examples where you can actually have marine national monuments, which is pretty interesting. We don't have, marine national forest, right? So it's pretty cool that we can actually protect these big, huge, expansive areas of United States waters out in the ocean. Now, the way that national monuments can be created by presidents is thanks to the Antiquities Act of 1906. This was an act by Congress that sort of handed over some power to the president, to the executive branch, to establish national monuments. And the primary idea behind national monuments, at least initially, was to protect places that had historic, archaeological, cultural significance, sites that could be, important from an archaeological perspective or from a cultural perspective. So these are places that, at least in the 1800s up into the early 1900s, there were a lot of places that had these types of sites, these archaeological sites and these cultural sites that were actually being basically vandalized. People were, grave robbing was an issue. People were stealing artifacts. And so that really was one of the main reasons that the Antiquities Act was put into place. And a really good example of an early national monument is Devil's Tower. Although the Lakota name for this feature on the landscape, which is a really fascinating geological feature, the original Lakota name, which is still used by people in that area, means Bear Lodge, which I think is actually a much a much better name than Devil's Tower. There's a lot of really cool stories behind that name. So there are currently 129 national monuments in the US, and in California we have 17. So we have a good chunk of those in California alone. The weird thing about national monuments is that they can have certain extractive activities happening within them despite their sort of elevated level of protection. And that's because of typically when a national monument is established by a president, let's say, usually that proclamation will grandfather in existing uses. And so you may see existing drilling and mining or logging or other, like commercial grazing, stuff like that might be allowed. Usually, though, the way it works is that you wouldn't see new mining, new drilling after that proclamation, but all that existing use could still be allowed. It just depends on how the president or the presidential proclamation is worded, or how Congress, if they choose to establish a national monument, how they word that legislation. So if you look at this, we go back to our sort of regional public lands map. You can see the Carrizo Plain National Monument is our only national monument right here in this area. You don't have to go too far to the east over here to get to the San Gabriel Mountains National Monument, though, which is another nearby monument. But the Carrizo Plain is definitely our closest and largest national monument, and it's really fascinating. It's sort of situated between the Caliente Mountains here and the Temblor Mountains. These are what we would call the innermost coast ranges here in this part of California. So it's basically like, this is the Los Padres, these are the Sierra Madre Mountains, this is the Cuyama River Valley, and then you would get to the Caliente Mountains, and then you would get to the Carrizo Plain itself, and then there's the Temblor Mountains, and then you're in the Central Valley, and you won't encounter mountains again until you get to the Sierra Nevada. So the other, cool thing about this national monument, and really the reason why this whole landscape is as geologically interesting and ecologically interesting as it is because of the San Andreas Fault, which you can actually really see. It's running completely through the national monument here. So that's the fault line right through there. And so there's plate movement on either side of that, and they're sort of rubbing up against each other. And that is causing some really cool features to have forms over the last many millions of years, but also currently still forming. And the other neat thing is it's got this really cool alkali wetland area called Soda Lake, which is, because this is what we call an endorheic basin, water flows into it from rain, from precipitation, but it doesn't leave this basin. And so it doesn't make it to the ocean. It just evaporates here. And that's what creates these really cool salt flats, which is what you're seeing here during drier times of the year. So it's a fascinating, wonderful place. It's also one of the sort of last remaining sort of mostly intact grassland ecosystems that would have been really common in the Central Valley, the San Joaquin Valley, and in the Carrizo Plain, historically. So it hosts a lot of different endangered and threatened species, like the blunt-nosed leopard lizard, which you can see here. This is a really cool species that you're not going to see in many other places. So the Carrizo Plain is one of the primary areas to actually see this species that is protected under the Endangered Species Act. And again, it has a lot of cultural significance, historical significance. There's this really amazing place called Painted Rock right in the middle of the National Monument, and it has some of the most incredible rock art that are hundreds to thousands of years old. that are created by the Chumash and the Yakuts and the Salonin. A lot of different tribal peoples, a lot of different indigenous peoples use this area as a sort of gathering place, an area to trade. And so there's a lot of rock art at this really special rock. It's pretty fascinating. Geologically, kind of going back to the San Andreas Fault, there's this really cool feature called Wallace Creek. And so it's actually basically it's an S-shaped creek, and the reason it is S-shaped is because the San Andreas Fault runs right through here. And so because this plate is moving this way and this plate is moving that way, it has actually pushed this the creek should be flowing just straight this way, but it has been this plate movement, this tectonic plate movement has been pushing it that way. And so it's kind of turned it into this S shape. So it's a wonderful place to go and see the San Andreas Fault in action. It's really cool. Here's some other scenes. I just think it is a really stunning national monument, a stunning landscape in general. These are the Elkhorn Hills and the Timbler Mountains. They're really beautiful any time of year, but sometimes they have these really amazing wildflower blooms during certain years when all the right conditions align. You can get super blooms here, which are pretty fascinating. There are some places to camp. There are two campgrounds. This is one called KCL Campground with the Timbler Mountains in the background in the view here. Wonderful places to camp and go look at the night sky and kind of get away from light pollution and just kind of get away from people in general. It's very, you're not likely to see a lot of people out here except during super blooms. It's just a wonderful, wonderful place. All right, let's talk about national forest. So these are managed by the Forest Service, which is again under the Department of Agriculture. So it's a little different than. And I should have mentioned about the national monuments. So again, multiple agencies can manage national monuments. There are plenty of national monuments that are mostly managed by the Forest Service, like Giant Sequoia National Monument. That's a good example of a monument that is managed primarily by the Forest Service because it was national forest land before it became a national monument. The Carrizo Plain is a really interesting example of it's managed by the state and the federal governments, but also it's also sort of partly managed by the Nature Conservancy because they own a lot of land that got incorporated into the national monument as well. So the primary agency that manages the Carrizo Plain, though, is the Bureau of Land Management, which is under the Department of the Interior. So national forest, there's a lot of national forest land in the United States, 188 million acres to be exact. And we have a big national forest right here in our region called the Los Padres National Forest. That's what you see here. This is Santa Barbara and the Pacific Ocean. There are some interesting aspects of this forest, which is that it's actually not very forested. It's mostly chaparral. It's mostly shrubland. That's kind of unique to Southern California. There are a few national forests in this region that aren't really forested in the sort of traditional sense, but they're still considered national forest and managed by the Forest Service. Most national forests were designated by presidents before 1940. Only 11 of them have been designated since 1940. So this is kind of interesting because we see national parks and especially national monuments. A lot of those were created well after 1940. A lot of them were created in the 21st century. Some have been very recently created. We have national parks that have been created just within the last couple of years. So yeah, this is really sort of odd in a lot of ways, but it is what it is. And I think national forests are they're one of the harder sort of federal public lands systems to understand the history of, like how did we get to where we are today with national forest. And you have to go back to the 1891 Forest Reserve Act. I mean, that's generally where it started, although there's little things here and there that happened before 1891 that were kind of laying the groundwork for this. But the Forest Reserve Act, I think, is the really first solid, beginnings of the national forest system. And so let's just look at the Los Padres National Forest timeline, because it's convoluted. So between 1898 and 1898 and 1899, there were these two forest reserves that were created after the Forest Reserve Act was passed. So we had the Pine Mountain and Zaca Lake Forest Reserve and the Santa Ynez Forest Reserve. And then in 1903, those were both consolidated and they became the Santa Barbara Forest Reserve. And then a few years later, you had a few other national or forest reserves created, like the San Luis Obispo Forest Reserve, the Monterey, Pinnacle, San Benito. Those were all consolidated as the Monterey National Forest in 1908. The Santa Barbara Forest Reserve then in that same year became the Santa Barbara National Forest. The San Luis Obispo Forest Reserve was added to that national forest. The Monterey National Forest was then added to the Santa Barbara National Forest in 1919. At some point, the San Benito Forest Reserve that was part of the Monterey National Forest, that got removed, and that eventually, I think, sort of led the way to Pinnacle, like how Pinnacles became a thing. And in 1936, after all of this convoluted stuff, it was finally, you had this, what is the national forest that you see today, that was renamed from the Santa Barbara National Forest to the Los Padres National Forest in 1936 by FDR. So this is not unusual. This is how a lot of national forests sort of got their start. Some have even more convoluted histories, but I just wanted to give you a sense of there's a lot to how national forest became national forest. It's a little more complicated than someone just saying this is now a national forest. So the Los Padres, again, this is our nearest national forest in this region. This is the one that I focus on the most. It's also our largest in this area. It's almost 2 million acres, most of which is publicly owned, but there's still about 12% of that is privately owned. Those are what we call private inholdings within this forest boundary. So that kind of explains, if you've ever driven into the national forest and you see that sign that says entering the Los Padres National Forest, but then you see homes and things like that, that's because there's an administrative boundary, which is the boundary in which land can be publicly owned as the national forest. So theoretically, one day, there could be private landowners that still have, land within this boundary, and they want to sell that land. They can sell it to the national forest, to the Forest Service, and it can become part of the Los Padres. So it's a little confusing how that works, but that's fairly common across national forests. So we have 5 ranger districts. And those are sort of administrative boundaries within the Los Padres. And again, it's not really very forested. It's mostly chaparral. It's mostly shrubland ecosystems. And that's what you see here. This is in Ventura County. This is what a lot of the Los Padres looks like. So people that come from other areas where they are very familiar with national forest and, actually seeing trees everywhere, it can be a little confusing when you come to this region and you see that there's not a lot of trees. And that's normal. That's just part of our, location and climate here in California. So what's interesting about the Los Padres and the other 3 Southern California National Forests, which would be the Angeles National Forest, the Cleveland, and the San Bernardino National Forest. All of them were not designated originally for timber production, which is the primary reason that most national forests were created, was for timber production. So the Southern California National Forests were actually designated initially as watershed protection, basically, which is pretty interesting and different than most other national forests in the country. However, because it is part of the National Forest System and under the Department of Agriculture, the Forest Service approaches land management differently than, say, the National Park Service. They have what they call their multi-use mandate. So they have to consider and potentially allow certain types of uses that, we as conservation minded people and organizations may not really like and, find ecologically damaging. they still can allow those activities. So you see still a lot of commercial grazing, mining, intensive off-road vehicle use, and also logging in national forest in general. And in the Los Padres, it is the only national forest in California that has active oil drilling. That's what you're actually seeing here is these are oil wells in the Los Padres that are permitted by the Forest Service, and then a private company manages them. That is pretty unusual. That's not super common across the US. It's certainly a little more common in like Wyoming. You'll see some drilling in one of the national forests there. But it is definitely unusual in California, and it can be pretty unfortunate in a lot of ways. So you can see this. This is like the southern Los Padres area. So this is Fillmore and Ojai. And so you can see a lot of drilling in this part of Los Padres, especially. This is in the Sespe oil field. So not only do you have active oil drilling in the Los Padres National Forest, but it's also right next to the Sespe Condor Sanctuary. So that just has a whole host of problems that go along with it. One of the reasons I really like national forest is because they generally allow dogs. And if you've ever been to a national park or a state park, you'll probably notice that dogs, there's a lot of restrictions on where you can have your dog. They generally need to be on leash, and they usually are restricted to like roads and campgrounds or paved trails. National forests, for the most part, don't have those types of restrictions. So I get to take my dog Leela, who you can see is enjoying life here in the Los Padres. That's one of my favorite parts of visiting the Los Padres, is getting to take my dog. And I think it's important to mention for especially for this webinar, because it is being hosted by Runners for Public Lands. The Los Padres is an excellent place to go trail running. There are so many different trails. There are hundreds of miles of trails. A lot of them are prime for trail running. And this is true of a lot of national forests across the country. These are great places to go and run and experience these incredible landscapes at the same time. It's also a great place for camping. There are, I don't remember how many campgrounds, many dozens of campgrounds, many of which are like car campgrounds, so you can actually drive right up to them. There is one issue, which is that a lot of these are actually managed by a private company that's permitted by the Forest Service. So there's some issues there. It's not an ideal situation, but that's sort of where we're at in terms of Forest Service, budgets and things like that. They will often sort of outsource management of their own recreation sites to private companies, which does have some issues. But this is an example of, I believe this is a campground where it's not managed by a private company. This is still managed by the Forest Service. And this is in Ventura County. So this is a really cool place to go camp. Let's move on to national wildlife refuges. These are managed very specifically by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which you may not be familiar with as a land management agency. This is the agency that mostly does work with, like protecting threatened and endangered species. That's a lot of what the Fish and Wildlife Service does. But they do manage the national wildlife refuges in this region and across the United States. And we have a couple here, and they are primarily for California condor protection, which is what you see here. This is the Hopper Mountain National Wildlife Refuge. And these are California condors roosting in some dead trees up here. So these wildlife refuges are generally established for the conservation, management, and restoration of fish, wildlife, and plant resources and their habitats. They do allow hunting and fishing under some circumstances. Certain national wildlife refuges will allow that in some ways. And there are 568 refuges in the US, including 38 in California alone. So there are a lot of these. Some of them are quite small, and some of them are pretty big, but they're generally never as big as like national forests or even most national monuments or parks. But you can see them here. These are the two that are in our region. This is Hopper Mountain, which was established in 1974, and then Bitter Creek, established in 1985. And again, these were mostly established to protect California condor habitat, because if you know anything about the California condor, it was experiencing major population declines up into the 80s. And these were sort of the places where they were restricted to in the very end before they were removed. Basically the last remaining wild condors were removed from the wild and put into captivity for a breeding program. And then they started releasing them into the wild at these two sites. So that's a big part of the history of these refuges, is tied to the California condor. And what's cool is that we have these two condor sanctuaries. These are just especially protected areas within the Los Padres National Forest. These are areas where humans can't go in. So you should not be visiting these places. You can walk through some little trail corridors that have been carved through them. Like if you've ever been up to the Doe Flat or Alder Creek area, you're sort of walking through the Sespe Condor Sanctuary, but you shouldn't be going off in either direction into it. And that's just a restriction to help California condors recover, because they are still recovering. Their populations are increasing slowly but surely. But what's cool is that we have this sort of connected landscape where condors can continue to recover and hopefully thrive. So national recreation areas. These are another one that are sort of like national monuments in that they're a little tricky in terms of like who manages them. So it can be multiple agencies. I would say national recreation areas are maybe the most unique in terms of management. They're very different than some of the other public land types that I just talked about. There's not a lot of national recreation area in the country. There's 8 million acres, which of course is a lot of land, but spread out across the whole country, it's not as much as you might think. But the big one, and perhaps one of the best examples of how complex the management can be, is the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, which I'll really talk about mostly here. These recreation areas are established by an act of Congress, and they typically are comprised of federal, state, and local public lands. We have 40 of them in the US, and there are 4 of those, about 10% are within California alone. So the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area is one of the larger recreation areas and is really interesting in how it's managed. It's about 153,000 acres. It was established in 1978 to preserve and enhance its scenic, natural, and historical setting and its public health value as an airshed for the Southern California metro area, while providing for the recreational and educational need of the visiting public. This is one of the few times where you really see air quality protection sort of invoked as a reason for establishing a piece of public land. So this is really fascinating. And you can kind of understand why, though, when you look at this as a satellite image of the area. So everything within this purple boundary is within the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area boundary, but not necessarily. There's a lot of private land, kind of like national forest, right? There's a lot of private land within here. But this is sort of the boundary within which any piece of public land or private land that is, open to the public or managed for conservation, they can all be part of this national recreation area. But what's so fascinating about this is that it is sort of this island of mostly wildland, ecosystems and vegetation in a sea of urban and suburban environments. So this is, of course, the LA Basin and the San Fernando Valley. And then you've got Oxnard and Ventura over here. There's just, so much development that has happened around this area. It's a really, really important place in terms of wildlife protection and also outdoor recreation for these communities. So when you look at the sort of land ownership or managing agencies, it's very, very very interesting. There are 200 plus parks and preserves within this boundary that are managed as part of the National Recreation area, and there are 28 different state, local, and federal agencies, as well as some nonprofits that are co-managing these lands as part of the national recreation area. I can't stress this enough how interesting this is and how different it is from a lot of other public land types within within the country. And so the big ones, of course, are Point Mugu State Park, Malibu Creek State Park, Topanga State Park. There's some other state parks in here. Those sort of create the backbone of the national recreation area. But there's a lot of other public lands in here that are really interesting. And speaking of backbone, I didn't mean to make that connection, but there's the Backbone Trail, which is a really cool trail that goes through a lot of these different pieces of public land, and basically completely transects, or bisects the national recreation area. So it's a fascinating place, and there's a lot to explore there and to appreciate. So the last thing I'm going to talk about, and then we'll be done with this portion of the webinar. We can get to some questions. Wilderness areas, and I realize, when I lead hikes and I talk about public lands in general, and when I talk about wilderness areas, people get a little confused about what these actually are. Wilderness areas are just sort of an elevated layer of protection on an existing type of public land. So it's a little bit like national monuments, right? Those start out as, like, let's say a national forest, and then part of that national forest gets elevated to national monument status. It's still managed by the Forest Service, right? It's the same way with wilderness. So you can have wilderness in national parks and national forest on Bureau of Land Management land, and they will still be managed by those agencies. We have 111 million acres of wilderness, designated wilderness in the U.S. And this is one of my personal favorites. This is the Sespe Wilderness. This is Piedra Blanca, really fascinating place just north of Ojai. If you've never been, highly recommend it. But this is a wilderness area. And this all stems from the 1964 Wilderness Act, which really considered that populations were expanding exponentially, basically, and that there was a lot of mechanization or industrialization of the landscape that was occurring because of that. And so the whole point of the Wilderness Act was to try to set aside places that wouldn't be subject to these industrial activities, these mechanized activities. And so this is a really interesting piece of legislation, and was pretty forward thinking in terms of how how landscapes were being impacted and are still being impacted by human activities, mainly industrial human activities. This is another really cool wilderness area in the Los Padres National Forest. This is the San Rafael Wilderness. That's the Hurricane Deck, if you've ever heard of that. Really, really cool place. So wilderness areas, they have to be established by an act of Congress. They are mostly in national forests, national parks, and on Bureau of Land Management lands, but they can be in some other types of public lands as well. There are 803 designated wilderness areas in the U.S., and we have a lot of those in California. And so you can see a lot of these are in national forests. Those are the green ones. But we have some really big ones that are in national parks, like Death Valley. Most of Death Valley National Park is actually designated wilderness. And I should mention, this is basically the highest level of protection that a piece of public land can get, federal public land can get. So this is really important for conservation. And in California, we have 152 of these. They're 6 million acres in total, and they only allow foot and, in some cases, horse travel. So you cannot be out there, in a vehicle, on a motorcycle or an ATV, or even mountain bikes. So these very specifically do not allow mechanized transport. So one of the largest in the Los Padres, and again, this is one of my absolute favorite places in the world, is the Sespe Wilderness. It's 220,000 acres in size. This is a huge wilderness. This is an area out by Doe Flat in Ventura County, just a beautiful, beautiful place. And it has a lot of different ecosystems in it, including some high elevation mixed conifer forest that are not, they're not super abundant across the Los Padres, but you can find them on like Pine Mountain, for example, in the Sespe Wilderness. But it also is a lot of chaparral. That's mostly what this landscape is. So really cool, fascinating place that has a diversity of landscapes and ecosystems, very special. And we are poised to get some more wilderness designations in the Los Padres National Forest and the Carrizo Plain National Monument if the Central Coast Heritage Protection Act gets passed by Congress and then signed into law by a president. This is a bill that has been sort of it's been working its way through Congress over and over, for many years, for over a decade now. And the last couple of years, it's gotten really, really close to actually passing both houses. So it has, for the last couple of years, been passing the House of Representatives, the U.S. House of Representatives, but it can't seem to get a vote in the Senate. Right now, as an example, it is part of a larger piece of legislation called the Protecting America's Wilderness Act, which would designate wilderness in many other places across mostly the Western United States as well. And that has been attached to it's the National Defense Authorization Act, which is one of those must-pass bills. And it passed the House of Representatives, but whether or not it will stay as part of the NDAA, that Defense Act, is to be determined. So there's this process right now where the Senate and the House of Representatives are going through this reconciliation process and determining which amendments and which parts of the bill will stay in the final package. So we'll see. Maybe this will be the lucky year and it'll get passed. And not only will it include new wilderness areas entirely, it will also add to existing wilderness areas like the Chumash Wilderness, for example, would grow quite significantly into this really fascinating landscape called we call them the Cuyama Badlands. The Carrizo Plain National Monument would get some new wilderness. It doesn't have any existing wilderness out there, but there would be some new ones established. It would also establish some national scenic areas, which I didn't really talk about. These are not quite the level of protection that wilderness areas provide, but they are uniquely designated and managed. And it would also establish some new wild and scenic rivers, which is another sort of type of public land, another designation that I didn't really talk about. It's a little more complicated, but yeah, this is really, hopefully this passes. We've been working on this with a lot of other groups and partners for many years, trying to get this passed. So hopefully one day soon. Okay, well, thank you all for being here, and for those of you watching at a later date, this should be available on YouTube and on the Runners for Public Lands website. Feel free to share this and come back and look at it if you're trying to remember what a national monument is. We may have some information below. I don't know if we have any links to useful resources, but definitely check out Los Padres ForestWatch and Runners for Public Lands. We both have great websites with lots of good information. You can check us out on Instagram and other social media. You can follow me on Instagram if you want to see more of my photography and some of my nature education stuff that I do. It's Bryant the Shrublander on Instagram. I do a lot of stuff where I talk about specific plant species and wildlife, and you may find that interesting and useful. So anyway, I think this is probably where we will stop the recording, and hope to see you at a future RPL or Forest Watch event. Thanks again for watching.